Hello and welcome to another chapter of Measle and the Wrathmonk by Ian Ogilvy, illustrated by Mould and published by Oxford University Press. So where we'd left off, Measle's plan had worked and they'd managed to revert Basil's spell back onto himself, thus turning Basil into a cockroach instead of Measle. The problem is that now Basil is running around the train set as a giant cockroach hunting down Measle and the rest of his new friends. Problem is that they'd managed to hold themselves up inside the tunnel that they built earlier, but the cockroach had found them in there and was starting to claw its way in, and so the victims had to find another way to escape the giant cockroach. They'd managed to get through the table and managed to find the cables, the electrical cables, which run all the way up the length of the cable to the control box at the top, which is like the big metal box, and they figured that if they could somehow get there, they'd be safe. And where we'd left off, they'd managed to just reach that steel box. So let's see how we go with this chapter. Let's see what happens. This is chapter 8 out of 10, so we've not got that long to go now. And this is the steel box. You can see them there peeking through the grill of the box. What are they all looking so horrified for? Let's find out. That night, once again, the bat came flapping in great circles over the tabletop. Crack, crack, crack went its wide leather wings. The group, woken from fitful sleep by the sound, pressed their faces against the grill. They could see the bat's huge shadow against the pale walls of the attic. They watched as it wheeled over the great table, and they saw it suddenly check its flight, seeming to hover for a moment, before it dived straight for the town hall. "It's seen the cockroach," said Frank. The town hall was shrouded in darkness, and anyway, at this distance they were unable to see what was going on, but they could hear. And what they heard was very strange. A great cacophony came from the town square, a screeching and a scratching and a rattling and an odd and very unpleasant high-pitched hissing that seemed to go on for several minutes. "What's happening?" said Lady Grant. "Why doesn't it just grab the revolting thing and fly away?" The reason the bat simply take hold of the giant cockroach was this. Inside the insect's brain were remnants of Basil's mind. And Basil was no fool, which made the cockroach that he'd become a lot smarter than the average cockroach. For the first time in his long and evil life, Basil was afraid. And what he feared was his own little pet, Cuddlebug. He knew that Cuddlebug would never recognise his master under the black shiny carapace of the cockroach. He knew that Cuddlebug would merely think he'd found the finest and largest meal of his life. So Basil, the cockroach, had to find shelter. He'd smashed his way into the town hall, ramming his huge body through the centre doors and bringing down most of the front wall, and a good part of the ceiling with it. Even with this destruction, there was enough left of the town hall to shield him from the bat's talons, and by turning his hard, shell-covered wing cases towards the shattered front of the building, Basil presented to his attacker a smooth, solid and unbreakable surface, which the bat, scratching and clawing as hard as it could, was unable to get hold of. The curved talons scraped and slid over the unyielding surface, and all the time Basil the cockroach kept his body pressed hard against the back wall of the room, clinging on with his claws and never budging an inch, and all the while he kept up a steady, high-pitched hissing sound, which, to the listeners inside the steel box out of the control centre, was the only noise that they were unable to identify. And look, there's Basil the cockroach, scuttling about and breaking in at the town hall to try and save himself from the bat. "What's going on over there?" said William. "Sounds like a fight of some sort," said Kip. "I think the bat's having problems." Then there was silence. They stared through the grill, straining their eyes in the darkness. A moment later, they heard the whoosh as the bat took off, and the crack, crack, crack of its wings fading into the distance as it flew towards the broken window at the far end of the attic. "Did it get it?" Prudence asked. "Let's hope so," said William. Then, far away, They heard a shuffling, scraping sound as if some great creature was shifting its body into a different position. I think I spoke too soon, said William. I don't know how it did it, but I think it beat the bat. Kitty was staring at the ceiling of the steel box. She said, I bet I could get through that. The rest of the group looked at her and then followed her gaze upwards. Set into the top of the box was a series of narrow slots, and through them they could just make out the rafters of the attic high above them. You silly girl, said Lady Grant. Why would you want to go through it? I bet I could see everything from up there. I bet you could, said William. And you're the only one who could squeeze through there too. I certainly couldn't, and that's a fact. Prudence shook her grey curls. But, my dear, what if it comes for you? Well, I can get back in quickly if it starts coming this way, said Kitty. You're a real little trooper, said Frank. OK, but be careful. Kip hoisted Kitty onto his broad shoulders. She reached out her hands and grasped the bars above her head. Then she stood upright on Kip's shoulders, and he took hold of her feet and gently pushed her upwards. Kitty wriggled her shoulders, then the rest of her body through one of the slots, and a moment later was standing on the top of the control centre. Oh, wow, they heard her say. What can you see? Said Kip. Everything, came back Kitty's voice. I can see all over the whole layout from up here. What about the town square? Well, it's a bit dark. But wait a minute. I can see the front of the building. It's all smashed in. Some of the roof has fallen down, but there's something moving in there, something big and shiny. It's turning round. It's coming out. Oh, help, it's coming this way. They saw Kitty's legs dropping down through the slot, and Kip stepped forward and grabbed her ankles and lowered her gently to the floor. It's the cockroach, all right, Kitty panted. It doesn't look like it's hurt at all. And it's headed straight here. They all heard the sound of its pattering feet drawing closer and closer, and they all smelt that cockroach stink as it reached the steel box. Its huge shadow fell across the grill on the wall. Then there was a slithering, rasping sound as it pulled its body up onto the top of the control centre. And then its black belly flattened against the ceiling slots. It's right on top of us, whispered William. We're safe enough, said Frank, but to be safer still, let's get under there. He pointed to the far wall. Some kind of electrical junction box stuck out from the side of the steel wall there, forming a low cave just beneath it. The group ran across the space and crawled under the ledge, just as one long, hairy black roach leg squirmed between the ceiling slots. They all pressed themselves tight into the small space, and the claw on the end of the leg touched the ground in exactly the spot where they had just been standing. Then it scraped slowly across the floor, weaving back and forth, covering every inch of the ground in its search for them. It tapped against the protruding ledge, and then curved round beneath the ledge and began to inch its way towards them. Lady Grant moaned in terror, pulling her feet away from the approaching horror, and as she did so, a shoe slipped off of her left foot. Without thinking, she reached forwards to snatch it, and Kip grabbed her by the wrist and dragged her backwards. But that shoe is a Measle, whispered Lady Grant. Do you have any idea what they cost? I don't care if it's a diamond the size of your head, lady, muttered Kip. Stay back. The claw scraped over the floor, and then it touched the shoe. It strained forward, the whole leg quivering with the effort, and then it hooked the shoe and pulled it back and up and out of sight. My lovely Measle, wailed Lady Grant. Well, at least we know how far it can reach, said Frank, and it can't rip its way in here. For the rest of the night, the cockroach stayed pressed against the roof of the control centre. Occasionally it pushed one of its legs through the slots and explored the interior of the box, while the group inside huddled close together under the protective ledge. Towards dawn, it shifted suddenly, sliding with a thump off the steel box and then pattering away towards the town square. Who knows the bat's coming back, said Frank. It'll head for the town hall again. Measle crawled out from under the ledge, and the rest followed him. They made themselves as comfortable as they could and waited for daylight. Measle couldn't sleep. Another idea was forming in his head. He stared up at the coils of the multicoloured wires that draped and looked around the inside of the box. He didn't know anything about electricity, but there was someone here that did. He went over to Frank, who was leaning against the wall grill, his eyes shut. "Frank, are you awake?" "I am now," said Frank, opening one eye. "I was wondering, do you think it's possible to get the power on?" "What, to the train set?" "Yeah." Frank raised one eyebrow. "What do you want to do that for?" "I'm not sure," said Measle with a shrug of his shoulders. "But could it be done from inside here?" Frank gazed up at the wires, his expert eyes flicking around at all the junctions and connections. "I suppose it could be done," he said at last. "It's just a question of rerouting a few lines. See that red cable? We could take a connection off that and then link it up to that black one over there. Yeah, it can be done." "What about making the trains move?" "You want the trains to move?" "Why? Have you had another idea?" "Well, I might have," said Measle, "but it all depends on the trains moving. Could that be done too?" Once again Frank stared up at the lines of the electrical cables. He didn't answer for some time, and all the while his eyes were scanning the wires. At last he said, "I think it could. We can't turn the spindles. They're too heavy for us, and those spindles control the train's speed. That would mean the trains would be going full tilt from the start. They'd probably come off the tracks on the tight corners. But it's the best we could do." "Could you control different trains?" "Yeah. Each one of those yellow wires goes to a different section of the track. All we have to do is patch in a temporary cable from there to there, one for each train, and we got it." "So what's the plan?" "There's one more thing I need to know," said Measle. He pointed to the grill set in the steel wall. "I'm going to have to get through there." Frank examined the narrow bars of the grill, and then he looked at Measle. "Well, you are skinny. You're not that skinny. Little Kitty might be able to do it, but not you." "It has to be me," said Measle firmly. "Could we cut one of the bars?" "It'll take some time," said Frank. "We've got 2 hacksaws between us, but that bar is pretty thick." "Could it be done?" "Yeah, it could be done." Frank stared hard at Measle. "But before we start on something that's going to take a good 2 hours, I'm going to want to know why." Measle sat down next to him and outlined his plan. As he did so, Frank's eyes got wider and wider, and when Measle finished, he let out a big sigh and said, "It's out of the question." "Why?" "Because it's too dangerous, that's why." "The mirror thing was dangerous too, and you all let me try that." Frank shook his head. "That was different," he muttered. "This time there's a lot more that could go wrong." "But you think it might work?" Frank thought for a moment. His forehead creased in a frown. Then he said, "It's possible. It's completely crazy, but it's possible. But we can't let you do it. If anybody does it, it ought to be an adult." "No," said Measle quietly. "It's got to be me. First of all, it'll take too long to cut enough of the bars to let an adult out. And second of all, it's me that Basil wants. It's me that he's furious at, not any of you. He just wants all of you back in your proper places. Me, he wants to kill." "And that's why we can't let you do it," said Frank, closing his eyes and leaning his head back against the grill. "What about if we voted on it?" said Measle. Frank sighed. "I guess you're going to tell them, aren't you? And I guess maybe some of them will want you to do it." Well, we live in a democracy, I suppose, and a democracy means that everybody gets a say, so... Alright, okay, if you insist, we'll take a vote. But let me tell you right now, I am voting. I am going to vote no. The vote was split right down the middle. Frank, Kitty and Prudence were strongly against the idea. Kip, William and Lady Grant were for it. Kip and William were worried by the scheme, but they both agreed that there seemed to be no alternative. Lady Grant just moaned and said, anything to save us from that revolting monster. Looks like we're stuck for a decision, said Frank. You can't go unless there's a clear majority, Measle. Well, what about me? Said Measle. Don't I get a vote? Of course he does, said William. It's the democratic way. Well, I vote yes too, said Measle. What a surprise, said Frank flatly. There was a lot to do. Kip and William began the long, tiring process of cutting through one of the bars on the steel grill. Their hacksaws were tiny compared to the thickness of the metal, and hour after hour of solid work they had only managed to cut halfway through one bar. Meanwhile, Frank was busy on the electrics, cutting through the plastic coating on one, splicing another onto the exposed copper, rerouting a third into a long loop that ran clear across the room, and all the time humming softly under his breath as he worked. Soon after daylight, the sawing work on the steel bar was stopped by a sudden loud buzzing noise. That seemed to come from all around them. Power's on, said Frank. There was the smell of ozone in the air, and already they could feel the interior of the box losing its nighttime chill. Frank dragged a length of red wires across the floor. "It can get pretty hot in here," he said. It took another hour to cut through the bar, and by the time they were finished, Kip and William were streaming with sweat, and William's hands had developed several blisters. Frank pulled the red cable to one of a row of junction boxes set high on the wall. He took a sharp knife from his toolbox and stripped the plastic sheathing from the end of the wire, exposing the bright copper strands. "Okay," he said. "Ready to go. All I've got to do is touch this cable end to one of those connections, and you've got a train. Question is, which one?" "Time for our lookout," said Kip. He hoisted Kitty onto his shoulders, lifted her up to the ceiling slots, and Kitty wriggled through the bars and onto the roof of the box. "Where's the cockroach?" Kip called up to her. "It's in the square, right up next to the statue. It's not moving. No, wait a minute. It's waving its antenna things." "Revolting," said Lady Grant, who had taken off her remaining shoe and was holding it close to her, as if it were some precious object. Kip turned to Measle. "Okay, we're all set, Measle. This is it." "Please be careful, Measle," said Prudence. Kip brought something out from behind his back. He held it out to Measle. "I think you might need this," he said. "Or rather, we might need it. It'll help us to see you." Measle took the object and examined it. It was a short length of wood with a small red triangular flag nailed to one end. "See," said Kip, "I thought you could stick one at the end of your belt. We've had a better chance of pinpointing your position. All we have to do is look for the flag." Measle pushed the end of the stick into the back of his trousers and tightened up his belt. The flag hung at arm's length over the top of his head. "Now," said Kip, "when you get outside, we should be able to see where you are." Everybody seemed to think it was a good idea. Measle thought it was an excellent one. He liked the idea that somebody would be following his progress. Somehow it made him feel just a little more secure. Frank was the only one who remained silent. Suddenly he stepped forward, frowning. "I don't want you to do this, Measle. In fact, vote or no vote, I've changed my mind. I'm not going to let you do it. It's just too dangerous." There was a long, awkward silence. Then William said, "Dear, oh dear, you sound like my boss. I thought this was a democracy." Frank nodded curtly. "It is. But somebody has to make responsible decisions. Measle's just a kid, for God's sake." Measle looked around the steel room, staring hopefully into each face for some show of support, but nobody wanted to meet his gaze. Their eyes slid away from his, some looking down at the floor and others peering up at the ceiling, and Kip shook his head sadly and said, "He's right, Measle, it's too risky. I know I voted to let you go, but I've changed my mind as well." William said, "Yeah, there must be another way. I'm sorry, Measle." Kitty sniffed. "I never wanted you to do it," she whispered. Measle looked at Lady Grant. She was sitting close to the wall, her hands limp at her sides, her legs stretched out in front of her. She met his eyes and Measle could see the indecision in her face. They looked at each other quite blankly for several seconds. Then she did a strange thing. She winked at him. There was another long silence, as awkward as the first. Then suddenly, and without warning, Lady Grant screamed. "Ow! Ow! That hurts! My hand! My hand!" Everybody stared at her. Her eyes were tightly closed and her whole face was screwed up in a tight grimace of pain. Her hand was hidden behind her back, and with her left she was clawing frantically at the air. Prudence hurried over to her and squatted by her side. "Whatever's the matter, dear? My hand! It's got my hand! Make it let it go! Ow! Ow!" Frank took 2 strides and was by her side. He bent over and grabbed her arm. "No, that hurts! Let me go!" shrieked Lady Grant. Frank pulled again, more gently this time. "What's got your hand? There's nothing there, Lady Grant. Look, there's nothing there." Lady Grant opened her eyes. "Isn't there? Really? Are you sure?" "Good heavens, you're right, but I could have sworn that something was biting my hand." Frank shook his head. "Well, there wasn't. I don't know what this is all about, but..." "Wait a minute." Lady Grant took a deep breath and yelled, "Now, Measle, now!" Frank whirled round. "No!" he shouted. He was too late. While everybody's attention was elsewhere, Measle had been edging steadily towards the grill, and now he stepped up to the gap in the iron bars, and with one fluid movement he wriggled through. "Measle, wait!" shouted Frank, reaching out through the bars. Kip put his hand on Frank's shoulder. "Let him go," he said quietly. "We can't stop him now." Frank turned and stared angrily at Lady Grant. "You shouldn't have done that," he said quietly. "That was a bad thing you did." Lady Grant tilted her head to one side and shrugged. "You won't see that if he saves us," she said calmly. Outside the safety of the steel box, Measle felt very alone and very exposed. He walked a little way until he could no longer hear the rest of the group. Then he turned and looked back. Kitty was standing on the roof of the control centre and she waved at him. Measle, feeling far from brave, waved back. Inside the box, everybody was so intent on watching Measle through the grill that nobody had noticed that Tinker until it was too late. The little dog slipped away from Prudence, tore silently towards the grill, and jumped with one bound onto Kip's back, over his head, and through the hole they had cut. He barked with pleasure at his newfound freedom and raced towards Measle. "No, Tinker," whispered Measle, "go back." Tinker took no notice. He wasn't going back in that strange dark box for anybody, not even for this nice smelly kid who was making shooing movements at him with his hands. He danced happily round Measle, his tongue lolling, his eyes rolling and yelping with joy. And suddenly, Measle didn't feel quite so alone anymore. "Come on then, dog," he said. "Let's go and do what we've got to do." He reached round his back and settled the stick into his right wristband. The flag fluttered gently over his head. Then he took a deep breath and began to walk away from the control box. And look, there's Tinker running to meet him. Well, that was some issue. That was I keep saying there's some issue. That was some chapter, eh? So, what's Measle got planned now? This is another one of Measle's brilliant ideas that we won't find out what it is until the next chapter. Frank doesn't like it. Frank seems to be a pretty good judge with these kind of things, so we'll need to see how this pans out. Either way, it's dangerous. But Measle's brave, although he doesn't feel brave. But him and Tinker, the dog, are going to go and see how this plan works out. So hopefully it works out for them. So tune in next time for Chapter 9, The Engine. Things are getting good now, eh? We're nearing the end now, guys. We've only got this and one more chapter to go, and then that's it. Book's done. So, hope you're enjoying it so far. Remember, kids, stay home, stay safe, help mum and dad protect the NHS and save lives. See you next time.